Hello again, everyone. How are we doing tonight? I hope that everybody had a lovely holiday yesterday. I know I did. I took a little break from this as a result of it, but I am back. I am refreshed, and I am ready to keep going. I also hope everybody's surviving with their physical and mental health intact. I was reading a open essay today from Danny Burstein, who is a member of the Broadway company of Moulin Rouge, and he had the virus, and he was describing both the symptoms that he had, the whole recovery process for him, and it's a very brave piece and very interesting to read. I quite enjoyed the insight that it had, and it just was one of those things that reminded me of the importance of keeping safe in this time and everything. So I hope everybody's doing that, and if you feel so inclined, seek out the piece. It really was an excellently written piece. So, without further ado, I think we're going to hop right back into Dune. Tonight's going to be a little bit of a longer one, but that's kind of by necessity because we've got two really long chapters back, and I don't want to read two really long chapters back to back. We're going to have a shorter one followed by one of the longer ones, but it shouldn't be too much longer, I wouldn't think. All right, so when last we left off, Dr. Kynes was wandering the desert and had a bit of a problem because he was left without a still suit, and unfortunately, he perished in the desert because of a pre-spice mass. And excuse me. Also, Paul and Jessica located the Fremen, led by Stilgar, and were able to negotiate a place among them. And Stilgar has placed Paul in the charge of a young girl named Cheney, who will become very interesting later on. All right, let's hop right in, shall we? The Fremen were supreme in that quality the ancients called Spannungsbogen, which is the self-imposed delay between desire for a thing and the act of reaching out to grasp that thing. From The Wisdom of Muad'Dib by the Princess Irulan. They approached Cave of the Ridges at dawnbreak, moving through a split in the basin wall so narrow they had to turn sideways to negotiate it. Jessica saw Stilgar detach guards in the thin dawnlight, saw them for a moment as they began their scrambling climb up the cliff. Paul turned his head upward as he walked, seeing the tapestry of this planet cut in, cross-section where the narrow cleft gaped toward gray-blue sky. Cheney pulled at his robe to hurry him, said, "Quickly, it is already light." "The men who climbed above us, where are they going?" Paul whispered. "The first day watch," she said. "Hurry now." A guard left outside, Paul thought. Wise. But it would have been wiser still for us to approach this place in separate bands. Less chance of losing the whole troop. He paused in the thought, realizing that this was guerrilla thinking, and he remembered his father's fear that the Atreides might become a guerrilla house. "Faster!" Cheney whispered. Paul sped his steps, hearing the swish of robes behind, and he thought of the words from the Sirat of Yue's tiny OC Bible. "Paradise on my right, hell on my left, and the angel of death behind," he called the quotation in his mind. They rounded a corner where the passage widened. Stilgar stood at one side, motioning them into a low hole that opened at right angles. "Quickly," he hissed. "We're like rabbits in a cage if a patrol catches us here." Paul bent for the opening, following Cheney into a cave illuminated by thin gray light from somewhere ahead. "You can stand up," she said. He straightened, studied the place, a deep and wide area with domed ceiling that curved away just out of a man's hand reach. The troop spread out through shadows. Paul saw his mother come up on one side, saw her examine their companions, and he noted how she failed to blend with the Fremen even though her garb was identical. The way she moved, such a sense of power and grace. "Find a place to rest and stay out of the way, child man," Cheney said. "Here's food." She pressed two leaf-wrapped morsels into his hand. They reeked of spice. Stilgar came up behind Jessica, called an order to a group on the left. Get the door seal in place and see to moisture security. He turned to another Fremen. Lemil, get glow globes. He took Jessica's arm. I wish to show you something, weirding woman. He led her around a curve of rock toward the light source. Jessica found herself looking out across the wide lip of another opening to the cave, an opening high in a cliff wall, looking out across another basin about 10 or 12 kilometers wide. The basin was shielded by high rock walls. Sparse clumps of plant growth were scattered around it. As she looked at the dawn-gray basin, the sun lifted over the far escarpment, illuminating a biscuit-colored landscape of rocks and sand. And she noted how the sun of Arrakis appeared to leap over the horizon. It's because we want to hold it back, she thought. Night is safer than day. There came over her such a longing for a rainbow in this place that would never see rain. I must suppress such longings, she thought. They're a weakness. I no longer can afford weaknesses. Stilgar gripped her arm, pointed across the basin. There you see proper Drusus. She looked where he pointed, saw movement. People on the basin floor scattering at the daylight into the shadows of the opposite cliff wall. In spite of the distance, their movements were plain in the clear air. She lifted her binoculars from beneath her robe, focused the oil lenses on the distant people. Kerchiefs fluttered like a flight of multicolored butterflies. That is home, Stilgar said. We will be there this night. He stared across the basin, tugging at his mustache. My people stayed out over late working. That means there are no patrols about. I'll signal them later, and they'll prepare for us. Your people show good discipline, Jessica said. She lowered the binoculars, saw that Stilgar was looking at them. They obey the preservation of the tribe, he said. It is the way we choose among us for a leader. The leader is the one who is strongest, the one who brings water and security. He lifted his attention to her face. She returned his stare, noted the whiteless eyes, the stained eye pits, the dust-rimmed beard and mustache, the line of the catch tube curving down from his nostrils into his stillsuit. Have I compromised your leadership by besting you, Stilgar? She asked. You did not call me out, he said. It's important that a leader keep the respect of his troop, she said. Isn't that one of those sand lice I cannot handle, Stilgar said. When you bested me, you bested us all. Now they hope to learn from you, the weirding way. And some are curious to see if you intend to call me out. She weighed the implications. By besting you in a formal battle. He nodded. I'd advise you against this, because they'd not follow you. You're not of the sand. They saw this in our night's passage. Practical people, she said. True enough. He glanced at the basin. We know our needs, but not many are thinking deep thoughts now this close to home. We've been out over long arranging to deliver our spice quota to the free traders for the cursed guild. May their faces be forever black. Jessica stopped in the act of turning away from him, looked back up into his face. The guild? What has the guild to do with your spice? It's Leet's command, Stilgar said. We know the reason, but the taste of it sours us. We bribe the guild with a monstrous payment in spice to keep our skies clear of satellites and such, that none may spy what we do to the face of Arrakis. She weighed out her words, remembering that Paul had said this must be the reason Arrakeen's skies were clear of satellites. And what is it you do to the face of Arrakis that must not be seen? We change it, slowly but with certainty, to make it fit for human life. Our generation will not see it, nor our children, nor our children's children, nor the grandchildren of their children, but it will come. He stared with veiled eyes out over the basin. Open water, and tall green plants, and people walking freely without stillsuits. So that's the dream of Leet Kynes, she thought. And she said, bribes are dangerous. They have a way of growing larger and larger. They grow, he said, but the slow way is the safe way. Jessica turned, looked out over the basin, trying to see it the way Stilgar was seeing it in his imagination. She saw only the grayed mustard stain of distant rocks, and a sudden hazy motion in the sky above the cliffs. Ah, Stilgar said. She thought at first it must be a patrol vehicle, then realized it was a mirage, another landscape hovering over the desert sand and distant wavering of greenery, and in the middle distance, a long worm traveling the surface with what looked like Fremen robes fluttering on its back. The mirage faded. "It would be better to ride," Stilgar said. "But we cannot permit a maker into this basin. Thus, we must walk again tonight." Maker? Their word for worm, she thought. She measured the import of his words, the statement that they could not permit a worm into this basin. She knew what she had seen in the mirage, Fremen riding on the back of a giant worm. It took heavy control not to betray her shock at the implications. "We must be getting back to the others," Stilgar said, "else my people may suspect I dally with you. Some already are jealous that my hands tasted your loveliness when we struggled last night at Tuono Basin." "That will be enough of that," Jessica snapped. "No offense," Stilgar said, and his voice was mild. "Women among us are not taken against their will, and with you—" He shrugged. "Even that convention isn't required." "You will keep in mind that I was a duke's lady," she said, but her voice was calmer. "As you wish," he said. "It's time to seal off this opening, to permit relaxation of stillsuit discipline. My people need to rest in comfort this day. Their families will give them little rest on the morrow." Silence fell between them. Jessica stared out into the sunlight. She had heard what she had heard in Stilgar's voice, the unspoken offer of more than his countenance. Did he need a wife? She realized she could step into that place with him. It would be one way to end conflict over tribal leadership. Female properly aligned with male. But what of Paul, then? Who could tell yet what rules of parenthood prevailed here? And what of the unborn daughter she had carried these past few weeks? What of a dead duke's daughter? And she permitted herself to face fully the significance of this other child growing within her, to see her own motives in permitting the conception. She knew what it was. She had succumbed to that profound desire shared by all creatures who are faced with death. The drive to seek immortality through progeny. The fertility drive of the species had overpowered them. Jessica glanced at Stilgar, saw that he was studying her, waiting. A daughter born here to a woman wed to such a one as this man. What would be the fate of such a daughter? She asked herself. Would he try to limit the necessities that a Bene Gesserit must follow? Stilgar cleared his throat and revealed then that he understood some of the questions in her mind. What is important for a leader is that which makes him a leader. It is the needs of his people. If you teach me your powers, there may come a day when one of us must challenge the other. I would prefer some alternative. There are several alternatives? She asked. The Sayadina, he said. Our Reverend Mother is old. Their Reverend Mother? Before she could probe this, he said, I do not necessarily offer myself as a mate. This is nothing personal, for you are beautiful and desirable. But should you become one of my women, that might lead some of my young men to believe that I'm too concerned with pleasures of the flesh, and not enough concerned with the tribe's needs. Even now, they listen to us and watch us. A man who weighs his decisions, who thinks of consequences, she thought. There are those among my young men who have reached the age of wild spirits, he said. They must be eased through this period. I must leave no great reasons around for them to challenge me, because I would have to maim and kill among them. This is not the proper course for a leader if it can be avoided with honor. A leader, you see, is one of the things that distinguishes a mob from a people. He maintains the level of individuals, to few individuals, and a people reverts to a mob. His words, the depth of their awareness, the fact that he spoke as much to her as to those who secretly listened, forced her to reevaluate him. He has stature, she thought. When did he learn such inner balance? The law that demands our form of choosing a leader is a just law, Stilgar said. But it does not follow that justice is always the thing a people needs. What we truly need now is a time to grow and prosper, to spread our force over more land. What is his ancestry? She wondered. Whence comes such breeding? She said, Stilgar, I underestimated you. Such was my suspicion, he said. Each of us apparently underestimated the other, she said. I should like an end to this, he said. I should like friendship with you, and trust. I should like that respect for each other which grows in the breast, without demand for the huddlings of sex. I understand, she said. "Do you trust me?"
I hear your sincerity.
"Among us," he said, "the Sayadina, when they are not the formal leaders, hold a special place of honor. They teach. They maintain the strength of God here." He touched his breast.
Now I must probe this Reverend Mother mystery, she thought. And she said, You spoke of your Reverend Mother, and I've heard words of legend and prophecy.
"It is said that a Bene Gesserit and her offspring hold the key to our future," he said.
Do you believe I am that one? She watched his face, thinking, The young reed dies so easily. Beginnings are times of such great peril.
"We do not know," he said.
She nodded, thinking, He's an honorable man. He wants a sign from me, but he'll not tip fate by telling me the sign.
Jessica turned her head, stared down into the basin at the golden shadows, the purple shadows, the vibrations of dust-mote air across the lip of their cave. Her mind was filled suddenly with feline prudence. She knew the cant of the Missionaria Protectiva, knew how to adapt the techniques of legend and fear and hope to her emergency needs. But she sensed wild changes here, as though someone had been in among these Fremen and capitalized on the Missionaria Protectiva's imprint. Stilgar cleared his throat. She sensed his impatience, knew that the day moved ahead and men wished to seal off this opening. There was a time for boldness on her part, and she realized what she needed. Some Dar al-Hikman, some school of translation that would give her Adab, she whispered. Her mind felt as though it had rolled over within her. She recognized the sensation with a quickening of pulse. Nothing in all the Bene Gesserit training carried such a signal of recognition. It could only be the Adab, the demanding memory that comes upon you of itself. She gave herself up to it, allowing the words to flow from her.
Ibn Kirtaiba, she said, as far as the spot where the dust ends.
She stretched out an arm from her robe, seeing Stilgar's eyes go wide. She heard a rustling of many robes in the background.
I see a Fremen with the Book of Examples, she intoned. He reads to Alat, the son whom he defied and subjugated. He reads to the Sadus of the trial, and this is what he reads. Mine enemies are like green blades eaten down that did stand in the path of the tempest. Hast thou not seen what our Lord did? He sent the pestilence among them that did lay schemes against us. They are like birds scattered by the huntsman. Their schemes are like pellets of poison that every mouth rejects.
A trembling passed through her. She dropped her arm. Back to her from the inner cave shadows came a whispered response of many voices.
Their works have been overturned. The fire of God mount over thy heart, she said, and she thought, now it goes in the proper channel.
The fire of God set alight, came the response. She nodded.
Thine enemies shall fall, she said.
Bila Kaifa, they answered. In the sudden hush, Stilgar bowed to her. Stilgar bowed to her. Sayadina, he said, if the Shai-Hulud grant, then you may yet pass within to become a Reverend Mother.
Pass within, she thought. An odd way of putting it, but the rest of it fitted into the cant well enough.
And she felt a cynical bitterness at what she had done.
Our Missionaria Protectiva seldom fails. A place was prepared for us in this wilderness. The prayer of the Salat has carved out our hiding place. Now, I must play the part of Ulia, the friend of God. Sayadina to rogue peoples who've been so heavily imprinted with our Bene Gesserit soothsay they even call their chief priestesses Reverend Mothers.
Paul stood beside Chaney in the shadows of the inner cave. He could still taste the morsel she had fed him, bird flesh and grain bound with spice honey and encased in a leaf. In tasting it, he had realized he never before had eaten such a concentration of spice essence, and there had been a moment of fear. He knew what this essence could do to him. The spice change that pushed his mind into prescient awareness.
Bila Kaifa,
Chaney whispered. He looked at her, seeing the awe with which the Fremen appeared to accept his mother's words. Only the man called Jameis seemed to stand aloof from the ceremony, holding himself apart with arms folded across his breast.
Duyaka hin mange,
Chaney whispered.
Duipunra hin mange. I have 2 eyes. I have 2 feet. And she stared at Paul with a look of wonder. Paul took a deep breath, trying to still the tempest within him. His mother's words had locked into the working of the spice essence, and he had felt her voice rise and fall within him like the shadows of an open fire. Through it all, he had sensed the edge of cynicism in her. He knew her so well. But nothing could stop this thing that had begun with a morsel of food. Terrible purpose. He sensed it, the race consciousness that he could not escape. There was the sharpened clarity, the inflow of data, the cold precision of his awareness. He sank to the floor, sitting with his back against rock, giving himself up to it. Awareness flowed into that timeless stratum where he could view time, sensing the available paths, the winds of the future, the winds of the past. The one-eyed vision of the past, the one-eyed vision of the present, and the one-eyed vision of the future, all combined in a trinocular vision that permitted him to see time become space. There was danger, he felt, of overrunning himself, and he had to hold on to his awareness of the present, sensing the blurred deflection of experience, the flowing moment, the continual solidification of that which is into the perpetual was. In grasping the present, he felt for the first time the massive steadiness of time's movement everywhere, complicated by shifting currents, waves, surges, and counter-surges, like surf against rocky cliffs. It gave him a new understanding of his prescience, and he saw the source of blind time, the source of error in it, with an immediate sensation of fear. The prescience, he realized, was an illumination that incorporated the limits of what it revealed. At once a source of accuracy and meaningful error. A kind of Heisenberg indeterminacy intervened. The expenditure of energy that revealed what he saw, changed what he saw. And what he saw was a time nexus within this cave, a boiling of possibilities focused here, where in the most minute action, the wink of an eye, a careless word, a misplaced grain of sand, moved a gigantic lever across the known universe. He saw violence with the outcome subject to so many variables that his slightest movement created vast shiftings in the pattern. The vision made him want to freeze into immobility, but this too was action with its consequences. The countless consequences, lines fanned out from this cave, and along most of these consequence lines, he saw his own dead body, with blood flowing from a gaping knife wound. So that's our first chapter, and here's our next one. My father, the Padishah Emperor, was 72, yet looked no more than 35, the year he encompassed the death of Duke Leto and gave Arrakis back to the Harkonnens. He seldom appeared in public wearing other than a Sardaukar uniform and a Berseg's black helmet with the imperial lion in gold upon its crest. The uniform was an open reminder of where his power lay. He was not always that blatant, though. When he wanted, he could radiate charm and sincerity, but I often wonder in these later days if anything about him was as it seemed. I think now he was a man fighting constantly to escape the bars of an invisible cage. You must remember that he was an emperor, father-head of a dynasty that stretched back into the dimmest history. But we denied him a legal son. Was this not the most terrible defeat a ruler ever suffered? My mother obeyed her sister's superiors, where the Lady Jessica disobeyed. Which of them was the stronger? History already has answered. In My Father's House, by the Princess Irulan. Jessica awakened in cave darkness, sensing the stir of Fremen around her, smelling the acrid stillsuit odor. Her inner time sense told her it would soon be night outside. The cave remained in blackness, shielded from the desert by the plastic hoods that wrapped their body moisture within this space. She realized that she had permitted herself the utterly relaxing sleep of great fatigue, and this suggested something of her own unconscious assessment on personal security within Stilgar's troop. She turned in the hammock that had been fashioned of her robe, slipped her feet to the rock floor and into her desert boots. I must remember to fashion the boots slip fashion to help my stillsuit's pumping action, she thought. There's so many things to remember. She could still taste their morning meal, the morsel of bird flesh and grain bound within a leaf with spice honey, and it came to her that the use of time was turned around here. Night was the day of activity, and day was the time of rest. Night conceals. Night is safest.
She unhooked her robe from its hammock pegs in a rock alcove, fumbled with the fabric in the dark until she found the top, slipped into it. How to get a message out to the Bene Gesserits, she wondered. They would have to be told of the two strays in Arakine's sanctuary. Glow globes came alight farther into the cave. She saw people moving there, Paul among them, already dressed and with his hood thrown back to reveal the aquiline Atreides profile. He had acted so strangely before they retired, she thought. Withdrawn. He was like one come back from the dead, not yet fully aware of his return, his eyes half shut and glassy with the inward stare. It made her think of his warning about the spice-impregnated diet. Addictive. Are there side effects? She wondered. He said it had something to do with his prescient faculty, but he has been strangely silent about what he sees. Stilgar came from shadows to her right, crossed to the group behind the glow globes. She marked how he fingered his beard and the watchful, cat-stalking look of him. Abrupt fear shot through Jessica as her senses awakened to the tensions visible in the people gathered around Paul, the stiff movements, the ritual positions. "They have my countenance," Stilgar rumbled. Jessica recognized the man Stilgar confronted. Jameis. She saw then the rage in Jameis, the tight set of his shoulders. Jameis, the man Paul bested, she thought. "You know the rules, Stilgar," Jameis said. "Who knows it better?" Stilgar asked, and she heard the tone of placation in his voice, the attempt to smooth something over. "I choose the combat," Jameis growled. Jessica sped across the cave, grasped Stilgar's arm. "What is this?" she asked. "It is the Amtal rule," Stilgar said. "Jameis is demanding the right to test your part in the legend." "She must be championed," Jameis said. "If her champion wins, that's the truth in it. But it's said," he glanced across the press of people, "that she'd need no champion from the Fremen, which can mean only that she brings her own champion." He's talking of single combat with Paul, Jessica thought. She released Stilgar's arm, took a half step forward. "I'm always my own champion," she said. "The meaning's simple enough for—" "You'll not tell us our ways," Jameis snapped. "Not without more proof than I've seen. Stilgar could have told you what to say last morning. He could have filled your mind full of the coddle, and you could have bird-talked it to us, hoping to make a false way among us." I can take him, Jessica thought, but that might conflict with the way they interpret the legend. And again, she wondered at the way the Missionaria Protectiva's work had been twisted on this planet. Stilgar looked at Jessica, spoke in a low voice, but one designed to carry to the crown's fringe. "Jameis is one to hold a grudge, Sayadina. Your son bested him, and—" "It was an accident!" Jameis roared. "There was witch force at Tuomo Basin, and I'll prove it now!" "And I've bested him myself," Stilgar continued. "He seeks by this Tahadi challenge to get back at me as well. There's too much of violence in Jameis for him ever to make a good leader. Too much gafla, the distraction. He gives his mouth to the rules and his heart to the Sarfa, the turning away. No, he could never make a good leader. I preserved him this long because he's useful in a fight as such. But when he gets this carving anger on him, he's dangerous to his own society." "Stilgar!" Jameis rumbled. And Jessica saw what Stilgar was doing, trying to enrage Jameis to take the fight away from Paul. Stilgar faced Jameis, and again Jessica heard the soothing in the rumbling voice. "Jameis, he's but a boy. He's—" "You named him a man," Jameis said. "His mother says he's been through the Gom Jabbar. He's full-fleshed and with a surfeit of water. The ones who carried their pack say there's liter-johns of water in it. Liter-johns! And us sipping our catch pockets the instant they show dew sparkle." Stilgar glanced at Jessica. "Is this true? Is there water in your pack?" "Yes." "Liter-johns of it?" "2 liter-johns." What was intended with this wealth? Wealth, she thought. She shook her head, feeling the coldness in his voice. "Where I was born, water fell from the sky and ran over the land in wide rivers," she said. "There were oceans of it, so broad you could not see the other shore. I've not been trained to your water discipline. I never before had to think of it this way." A sighing gasp arose from the people around them. Water fell from the sky. It ran over the land.
You know there's those among us who've lost from their catch pockets by accident and will be in sore trouble before we reach Tabor this night. How could I know? Jessica shook her head. If they're in need, give them water from our pack. Is that what you intended with this wealth? I intended it to save life, she said. Then we accept your blessing, Sayadina. You'll not buy us off with water, Jameis growled. Nor will you anger me against yourself, Stilgar. I see you trying to make me call you out before I prove my words. Stilgar faced Jameis. Are you determined to press this fight against the child, Jameis? His voice was low, venomous. She must be championed, even though she has my countenance. I invoke the Amtal rule, Jameis said. It's my right. Stilgar nodded. Then if the boy does not carve you down, you'll answer to my knife afterward. And this time I'll not hold back the blade as I've done before. You cannot do this thing, Jessica said. Paul's just... You must not interfere, Sayadina, Stilgar said. Oh, I know you can take me, and therefore can take anyone among us, but you cannot best us all united. This must be. It is the Amtal rule. Jessica fell silent, staring at him in the green light of the glow globes, seeing the demoniacal stiffness that had taken over his expression. She shifted her attention to Jameis, saw the brooding look at his brows, and thought, I should have seen that before. He broods. He's the kind, one who works himself up inside. I should have been prepared. If you harm my son, she said, you'll have me to meet. I'll call you out now. I'll carve you into a joint of... Mother. Paul stepped forward, touched her sleeve. Perhaps if I explained to Jameis how... Explain, Jameis sneered. Paul fell silent, staring at the man. He felt no fear of him. Jameis appeared clumsy in his movements, and he had fallen so easily in their night encounter on the sand. But Paul still felt the nexus boiling of this cave, still remembered the prescient visions of himself dead under a knife. There had been so few avenues of escape for him in that vision. Stilgar said, Sayadina, you must step back now. Well, stop calling her Sayadina, Jameis said. That's yet to be proved. So she knows the prayer. What's that? Every child among us knows it. He has talked enough, Jessica thought. I have the key to him. I can immobilize him with a word. She hesitated. But I cannot stop them all. You will answer to me, then, Jessica said, and she pitched her voice in a twisting tone with a little whine in it and a catch at the end. Jameis stared at her, fright visible on his face. I'll teach you agony, he said in the same tone. Remember that as you fight. You will have agony such as will make the Gom Jabbar a happy memory by comparison. You will writhe with your entire... So be it then, Stilgar said. He cast a warning glance at Jessica. If you speak again, Sayadina, we know it's your witchcraft, and you will be forfeit. He nodded for her to step back. Jessica felt hands pulling her, helping her back, and she sensed they were not unkindly. She saw Paul being separated from the throng, the elfin-faced Chaney whispering in his ear as she nodded toward Jameis. A ring formed within the troop. More glow globes were brought, and all of them tuned on the yellow band. Jameis stepped into the ring, slipped out of his robe, and tossed it to someone in the crowd. He stood there in a cloudy gray slickness of stillsuit that was patched and marked by tucks and gathers. For a moment he bent with his mouth to his shoulder, drinking from a catch-pocket tube. Presently he straightened, peeled off and detached the suit, handed it carefully into the crowd. He stood waiting, clad in loincloth and some tight fabric over his feet, a crysknife in his right hand. Jessica saw the girl-child Chaney helping Paul, saw her press a crysknife handle into his palm, saw him heft it, testing the weight and balance. And it came to Jessica that Paul had been trained in prana and bindu, the nerve and the fiber. That he had been taught fighting in a deadly school, his teachers men like Duncan Idaho and Gurney Halleck, men who were legends in their own lifetimes. The boy knew the devious ways of the Bene Gesserit, and he looked supple and confident. But he's only 15, she thought, and he has no shield. I must stop this. Somehow there must be a way to... She looked up,
saw Stilgar watching her. "You cannot stop it," he said. "You must not speak." She put a hand over her mouth, thinking,
I've planted fear in James's mind. It'll slow him some, perhaps. If I could only pray. Truly pray.
Paul stood alone now, just into the ring, clad in the fighting trunks he'd worn under his stillsuit. He held a crysknife in his right hand. His feet were bare against the sand-gritted rock. Idaho had warned him time and again, "When in doubt of your surface, bare feet are best." And there were Cheney's words of instruction still in the front of his consciousness.
James turns to the right with his knife after a parry. It's a habit in him we've all seen. And he'll aim for the eyes to catch a blink in which to slash you. And he can fight either hand. Look out for a knife shift.
But strongest in Paul, so that he felt it with his entire body, was training and the instinctual reaction mechanism that had been hammered into him day after day, hour after hour on the practice floor. Gurney Halleck's words were there to remember. "The good knife fighter thinks on point and blade and shearing guard simultaneously. The point can also cut. The blade can also stab. The shearing guard can also trap your opponent's blade." Paul glanced at the crysknife. There was no shearing guard, only the slim round ring of the handle with its raised lips to protect the hand. And even so, he realized that he did not know the breaking tension of this blade, did not even know if it could be broken. Jameis began sidling to the right along the edge of the ring opposite Paul. Paul crouched, realizing then that he had no shield, but was trained to fighting with its subtle field around him, trained to react on defense with utmost speed, while his attack would be timed to the controlled slowness necessary for penetrating the enemy's shield. In spite of constant warning from his trainers not to depend on the shield's mindless blunting of attack speed, he knew that shield awareness was part of him. Jameis called out in ritual challenge, "May thy knife chip and shatter!"
This knife will break then, Paul thought.
He cautioned himself that Jameis was also without shield, but the man wasn't trained to its use, had no shield fighter inhibitions. Paul stared across the ring at Jameis. The man's body looked like knotted whipcord on a dried skeleton. His crysknife shone milky yellow in the light of the glow globes. Fear coursed through Paul. He suddenly felt alone and naked, standing in dull yellow light within this ring of people. Prescience had fed his knowledge with countless experiences, hinted at the strongest currents of the future, and the strings of decision that guided them. But this was the real now. This was death, hanging on an infinite number of minuscule mischances. Anything could tip the future here, he realized. Someone coughing in the troop of watchers, a distraction, a variation in the glow globe's brilliance, a deceptive shadow.
I'm afraid,
Paul told himself. And he circled warily opposite Jameis, repeating silently to himself the Bene Gesserit litany against fear.
Fear is the mind killer.
It was a cool bath washing over him. He felt muscles untie themselves, become poised and ready. "I'll sheathe my knife in your blood," Jameis growled, and in the middle of the last word he pounced. Jessica saw the motion, stifled an outcry. Where the man struck, there was only open air, and Paul stood now behind Jameis with a clear shot at the exposed back. "Now, Paul, now!" Jessica screamed it in her mind. Paul's motion was slowly timed, beautifully fluid, but so slow it gave Jameis the margin to twist away, backing and turning to the right. Paul withdrew, crouching low. "First, you must find my blood," he said. Jessica recognized the shield fighter timing in her son, and it came over her what a two-edged thing that was. The boy's reactions were those of youth, and trained to a peak these people had never seen. But the attack was trained too, and conditioned by the necessities of penetrating a shield barrier. A shield would repel too fast a blow, admit only the slowly deceptive counter. It needed control and trickery to get through a shield. "Does Paul see it?" she asked herself. "He must." After Jameis attacked, ink-dark eyes glaring, his body a yellow blur under the glow globes. Again, Paul slipped away to return too slowly on the attack. And again, and again. Each time, Paul's counterblow came an instant late. And Jessica saw a thing she hoped Jameis did not see. Paul's defensive reactions were blindingly fast, but they moved each time at the precisely correct angle they would take if a shield were helping deflect part of Jameis's blow. "Is your son playing with that poor fool?" Stilgar asked. He waved her to silence before she could respond. "Sorry, you must remain silent." Now the two figures on the rock floor circled each other. Jameis, with knife hand held far forward and tipped up slightly. Paul crouched with knife held low. Again, Jameis pounced, and this time he twisted to the right where Paul had been dodging. Instead of faking back and out, Paul met the man's knife hand on the point of his own blade. Then the boy was gone, twisting away to the left and thankful for Cheney's warning. Jameis backed into the center of the circle, rubbing his knife hand. Blood dripped from the injury for a moment, stopped. His eyes were wide and staring, two blue-black holes, studying Paul with a new wariness in the dull light of the glow globes. "Ah, that one hurt," Stilgar murmured. Paul crouched at the ready, and as he had been trained to do after first blood, called out, "Do you yield?" "Ha!" Jameis cried. An angry murmur arose from the troop. "Hold!" Stilgar called out. "The lad doesn't know our rule." Then to Paul, "There can be no yielding in the Tahadi challenge. Death is the test of it." Jessica saw Paul swallow hard, and she thought, he's never killed a man like this, in the hot blood of a knife fight. Can he do it? Paul circled slowly right, forced by Jameis's movement. The prescient knowledge of the time-boiling variables in this cave came back to plague him now. His new understanding told him there were too many swiftly compressed decisions in this fight for any clear channel ahead to show itself. Variable piled on variable. That was why this cave lay as a blurred nexus in his path. It was like a gigantic rock in the flood, creating maelstroms in the current around it. "Have an end to it, lad," Stilgar muttered. "Don't play with him." Paul crept further into the ring, relying on his own edge and speed. Jameis backed now that the realization swept over him, that this was no soft off-worlder in the Tahadi ring, easy prey for a Fremen crysknife. Jessica saw the shadow of desperation in the man's face. Now is when he's most dangerous, she thought. He sees that this is not like a child of his own people, but a fighting machine born and trained to it from infancy. Now the fear I planted in him has come to bloom. And she found in herself a sense of pity for Jameis, an emotion tempered by awareness of the immediate peril to her son. Jameis could do anything, any unpredictable thing, she told herself. She wondered then if Paul had glimpsed this future, if he were reliving this experience. But she saw the way her son moved, the beads of perspiration on his face and shoulders, the careful wariness visible in the flow of muscles, and for the first time she sensed, without understanding it, the uncertainty factor in Paul's gift. Paul pressed the fight now, circling but not attacking. He had seen the fear in his opponent. Memory of Duncan Idaho's voice flowed through Paul's awareness. "When your opponent fears you, then's the moment when you give the fear its own reign. Give it the time to work on him. Let it become terror. The terrified man fights himself. Eventually he attacks in desperation. That is the most dangerous moment, but the terrified man can be trusted usually to make a fatal mistake. You are being trained here to detect these mistakes and use them." The crowd in the cavern began to mutter. They think Paul's toying with Jameis, Jessica thought. They think Paul's being needlessly cruel. But she sensed also the undercurrent of crowd excitement, their enjoyment of the spectacle, and she could see the pressure building up in Jameis. The moment when it became too much for him to contain was as apparent to her as it was to Jameis, or to Paul. Jameis leaped high, feinting and striking down with his right hand. But the hand was empty. The crysknife had been shifted to his left hand. Jessica gasped. But Paul had been warned by Cheney. Jameis fights with other hand. And the depth of his training had taken in that trick. "Keep the mind on the knife and not on the hand that holds it," Gurney Halleck had told him time and again. "The knife is more dangerous than the hand, and the knife can be in either hand." And Paul had seen Jameis's mistake. Bad footwork, so that it took the man a heartbeat longer to recover from his leap, which had been intended to confuse Paul and hide the knife shift. Except for the low yellow light of the glow globes and the inky eyes of the staring troop, it was similar to a session on the practice floor. Shields didn't count where the body's own movement could be used against it. Paul shifted his own knife in a blurred motion, slipped sideways, and thrust upward where James's chest was descending, then away to watch the man crumble. James fell like a limp rag, face down, gasped once, and turned his face toward Paul, then lay still on the rock floor. His dead eyes stared out like beads of dark glass. Killing with the point lacks artistry, Idaho had once told Paul, but don't let that hold your hand when the opening presents itself. The troop rushed forward, filling the ring, pushing Paul aside. They hid James in a frenzy of huddling activity. Presently, a group of them hurried back into the depths of the cavern, carrying a burden wrapped in a robe, and there was no body on the rock floor. Jessica pressed through toward her son. She felt that she swam in a sea of robed and stinking backs, a throng strangely silent. Now is the terrible moment, she thought. He has killed a man in clear superiority of mind and muscle. He must not grow to enjoy such a victory. She forced herself through the last of the troop and into a small open space where two bearded Fremen were helping Paul into his stillsuit. Jessica stared at her son. Paul's eyes were bright. He breathed heavily, permitting the ministrations to his body rather than helping them. "Him against James and not a mark on him," one of the men muttered. Cheney stood to one side, her eyes focused on Paul. Jessica saw the girl's excitement, the admiration in the elfin face. It must be done now, and swiftly, Jessica thought. She compressed ultimate scorn into her voice and manner, said, "Well now, how does it feel to be a killer?" Paul stiffened as though he had been struck. He met his mother's cold glare, and his face darkened with a rush of blood. Involuntarily, he glanced toward the place on the cavern floor where James had lain. Stilgar pressed through to Jessica's side, returning from the cave depths where the body of James had been taken. He spoke to Paul in a bitter, controlled tone. "When the time comes for you to call me out and try for my burden, do not think you will play with me the way you played with James." Jessica sensed the way her own words and Stilgar's sank into Paul, doing their harsh work on the boy. The mistake these people made. It served a purpose now. She searched the faces around them as Paul was doing, seeing what he saw. Admiration, yes, and fear, and in some, loathing. She looked at Stilgar, saw his fatalism, knew how the fight had seemed to him. Paul looked at his mother. "You know what it was," he said. She heard the return to sanity, the remorse in his voice. Jessica swept her glance across the troop, said, "Paul has never before killed a man with a naked blade." Stilgar faced her, disbelief in his face. "I wasn't playing with him," Paul said. He pressed in front of his mother, straightening his robe, glanced at the dark place of James's blood on the cavern floor. "I did not want to kill him." Jessica saw belief come slowly to Stilgar, saw the relief in him as he tugged at his beard with a deeply veined hand. She heard muttering awareness spread through the troop. "That's why you asked him to yield," Stilgar said. "I see. Our ways are different, but you'll see the sense in them. I thought we'd admitted a scorpion into our midst." He hesitated, then, "And I shall not call you lad the more." A voice from the troop called out, "Needs a naming still." Stilgar nodded, tugging at his beard. "I see strength in you, like the strength behind a pillar." Again he paused, then, "You shall be known among us as Usul, the base of the pillar. This is your secret name, your troop name. We of Siege Tabor may use it, but none other may so presume. Usul." Murmuring went through the troop. Good choice then. Strong, bring us luck. And Jessica sensed the acceptance, knowing she was included in it with her champion. She was indeed Sayadina. "Now, what name of manhood do you choose for us to call you openly?" Stilgar asked. Paul glanced at his mother, back to Stilgar. Bits and pieces of this moment registered in his prescient memory, but he felt the differences as though they were physical, a pressure forcing him through the narrow door of the present. "How do you call among you the little mouse, the mouse that jumps?" Paul asked, remembering the pop-hop of motion at Tuono Basin. He illustrated with one hand. A chuckle sounded through the troop. We call that one Muad'Dib, Stilgar said.
Jessica gasped. It was the name Paul had told her, saying that the Fremen would accept him and call him thus. She felt a sudden fear of her son and for him. Paul swallowed. He felt that he played a part already played over countless times in his mind. Yet there were differences. He could see himself perched on a dizzying summit, having experienced much and possessed of a profound store of knowledge, but all around him was abyss. And again he remembered the vision of fanatic legions following the green and black banner of the Atreides, pillaging and burning across the universe in the name of their prophet, Muad'Dib. That must not happen, he told himself.
Is that the name you wish, Muad'Dib? Stilgar asked.
I am an Atreides, Paul whispered, and then louder. It's not right that I give up entirely the name my father gave me. Could I be known among you as Paul Muad'Dib?
You are Paul Muad'Dib, Stilgar said.
And Paul thought, that was no vision of mine. I did a different thing. But he felt that the abyss remained all around him. Again, a murmuring response went through the troop as man turned to man. Wisdom with strength. Couldn't ask more. It's the legend for sure. Lisan al-Gaib. Lisan al-Gaib.
I will tell you a thing about your new name, Stilgar said. The choice pleases us. Muad'Dib is wise in the ways of the desert. Muad'Dib creates his own water. Muad'Dib hides from the sun and travels in the cool night. Muad'Dib is fruitful and multiplies over the land. Muad'Dib we call instructor of boys. That is a powerful base on which to build your life, Paul Muad'Dib, who is Usul among us. We welcome you.
Stilgar touched Paul's forehead with one palm, withdrew his hand, embraced Paul, and murmured, Usul. As Stilgar released him, another member of the troop embraced Paul, repeating his new troop name. And Paul was passed from embrace to embrace through the troop, hearing the voices, the shadings of tone. Usul, Usul, Usul. Already he could place some of them by name. And there was Chaney, who pressed her cheek against his as she held him and said his name. Presently Paul stood again before Stilgar, who said, Now you are of the Ikhwan Bedouini, our brother. His face hardened, and he spoke with command in his voice.
And now, Paul Muad'Dib, tighten up that steel suit.
He glanced at Chaney.
Chaney, Paul Muad'Dib's nose plugs are as poor a fit I've ever seen. I thought I ordered you to see after him.
And the making still, she said. There's Jameis, of course, but...
Enough of that.
Then I'll share one of mine, she said. I can make do with one until...
You will not, Stilgar said. I know there are spares among us. Where are the spares? Are we a troop together or a band of savages?
Hands reached out from the troop, offering hard, fibrous objects. Stilgar selected 4, handed them to Chaney.
Fit these to Usul and the Sayadina.
A voice lifted from the back of the troop.
What of the water still? What of the leader Johns in their pack? I know your need, Farok, Stilgar said.
He glanced at Jessica. She nodded. Broach 1 for those that need it. Stilgar said,
Watermaster. Where is a watermaster? Ah, Shimum. Care for the measuring of what is needed. The necessity and no more. This water is the dower property of the Sayadina, and will be repaid in the sietch at field rates less pack fees.
What is the repayment at field rates? Jessica asked.
10 for 1, Stilgar said.
But...
It's a wise rule, as you'll come to see, Stilgar said.
A rustling of robes marked movement at the back of the troop as men turned to get the water. Stilgar held up a hand, and there was silence.
As to Jameis, he said, I order the full ceremony. Jameis was our companion and brother of the Ichwan Bedouini. There should be no turning away without the respect due one who proved our fortune by his Tahadi challenge. I invoke the right, at sunset, when the dark shall cover him.
Paul, hearing these words, realized that he had plunged once more into the abyss. Blind time. There was no past occupying the future in his mind, except he could still sense the green and black Atreides banner waving, somewhere ahead, still see the jihad's bloody swords and fanatic legions. It will not be, he told himself. I cannot let it be. And there we go. Like I said, this was going to be a longer one tonight, but I hope you all stuck around. It was certainly an exciting one. So, that'll be it for me tonight, and I will see everyone again tomorrow. I hope everybody has a good day and a good evening tonight. Bye-bye.